Welcome to Murder Road Trip. I'm your host, Haley. Joining me on today's road trip is return guest Stephen Pappas. Stephen is the co-host of two podcasts, Is This Adulting and Meddling Kids. Stephen, can you tell us about your podcast?
Absolutely. Meddling Kids is a groovy review of all things Scooby-Doo. That's the tagline. I have actually been on an extended hiatus from that one for health reasons, so I will be back shortly, is the goal, within the next month on that show. And then Is This Adulting is more pertaining to those health reasons, and that is a mental health comedy show that I do with my best friend of 10 years, Chris, and we have awesome guests on, like yourself. And we laugh and joke and get real and talk about mental health and also silly, ridiculous things. So, yeah, check it out. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, as I've talked about on the previous million episodes you've been on, that I love both shows, and your most recent guests have been each of the three women from Wine and Crime, right?
Yes, that has been amazing. They are lovely human beings.
So you've had 3 whole episodes, 1 episode per guest.
Right. Yep.
So that's awesome. That's a really cool way of doing it and giving each woman their own episode and kind of their own time to talk and everything. I like that a lot.
Yeah, thanks. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Where can listeners find you?
Yeah, I'm all over the internet. You can find Meddling Kids at Meddling Kids Pod on Twitter, I believe. It is at isthisunderscoreadulting on Twitter. We are facebook.com/isthisadulting or isthisadultingpod.com are the easiest places to get me. Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, Pocket Casts, all that fun stuff.
It's like we can't turn a corner without finding you.
Exactly. I am everywhere. You can literally yell at your Alexa, whatever it's called, Echo, Amazon Echo, because I have one that we got for Christmas. You can literally yell at it to play my podcast, and all of a sudden it'll play. So you can't get away.
That's awesome. And then you also have the best friends group for Is This Adulting, right? And that's a really great place for people who want support and just a safe place to discuss, everything going on in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. That group is honestly, as much as I love the show and think what we do on the show is important, I think that the group is more important. Or at least equally important. It is a group of people coming together, providing support for each other, and it is really, really awesome to see people from all around the world come together and take care of each other.
It's a great place. Well, thank you for being my road trip buddy. We will be snacking on a Corll family classic, candied pecans, and a Texas invention, Fritos, as we make our way from Fort Wayne, Indiana to Houston, Texas, as we discuss Dean Corll in the Houston mass murders. Stephen, what made you pick Dean Corll for today's trip?
He's real messed up. It's fascinating to me, just the psyche of some of these killers, and that's why I've basically weaseled my way into every time you do a big name serial killer, letting me come on it with you, because I'm just fascinated by just what's going on in their head and how demented it is, and trying to wrap my brain around it. And I know I can never really grasp it, but it's just so interesting to me to kind of see how someone who seems like anybody else all of a sudden becomes some sort of monster.
Yeah, it's really crazy how your next door neighbor could be a serial killer and you just have no idea.
You might not have any idea. I'm convinced mine is.
Oh, gosh.
So
give me his name so I can start making notes now.
It's like a 70-year-old woman, but I'm convinced.
Oh, we need more female serial killers.
Mm-hmm. Especially of the elderly persuasion.
Ah, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on that note, are you ready to go?
Absolutely. Let's go.
We lost the station again.
Keep trying.
I'm safe.
If you would
Hold on. Let me try this one.
Stop. That's it. Turn it up. Turn it up. Dean Arnold Corll was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana on the 24th of December in 1939. His parents, Arnold and Mary, often disagreed about how children should be raised. Due to their disagreements, the couple divorced when Dean was 6 years old. Mary was awarded custody of Dean and his 4-year-old brother Stanley. Following the divorce, Arnold was drafted into the Air Force and was stationed in Memphis, Tennessee. Mary did not want to keep her children away from their father, so she moved herself and the boys to a house outside of Memphis. While living in Memphis, Mary and Arnold rekindled their relationship and were quickly remarried. Soon after, the family moved to Houston, Texas, but Mary and Arnold's relationship did not last long. They were divorced for the second time by the early 1950s.
It didn't take long for Mary to find a new husband in salesman Jake West. Mary moved herself and the 2 boys to live with Jake in Vidor, Texas. The newlyweds quickly had a daughter, whom they named Joyce, in 1955. While living in Vidor, Mary started a pecan candy business, which she named Pecan Prince. It is alleged that Mary started the pecan candy business after a pecan salesman came by and told her that she should really get into the pecan business. Dean and Stanley helped their mother with the business by hunting for pecans and helping deliver goods. While living in Vidor, Dean attended Vidor High School, where he was an average student and a trombone player. According to his classmates, Dean was quiet, polite, and clean-cut. He graduated in 1958. After Dean graduated, Mary moved her family of 5 to Houston, Texas, so that they could more easily sell their Pecan Prince products.
In 1960, when Dean was 21 years old, Dean's paternal grandfather passed away. Mary asked Dean if he would move back to Indiana to help care for his widowed grandmother. After 3 years in Indiana, Dean moved back to Texas when his mom and Jake divorced. Following the divorce, Mary moved the family to the Houston suburb, The Heights. Mary kept making pecan candies, this time in the home garage, and she renamed the business to Corll Candy Company. Dean and Stanley continued helping their mother with the business. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army. He was sent to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. Upon completing basic training, Dean was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia to attend radio repair school. After serving only 10 months, Dean applied for a hardship discharge because his mother needed help running Corll Candy Company. Dean was awarded an honorable discharge in June of 1965.
With Dean back home to help run the business, Corll Candy Company opened a physical store location across from Helms Elementary School in the Heights. Dean created a children's play area in the back of the store. Because he gave so much free candy away to kids, neighborhood children began referring to Dean as the Candy Man. Dean also began living on his own for the first time when he rented the apartment above the store.
In 1967, 12-year-old David Brooks, a 6th grade student, ventured into Corll Candy Company to buy some candy. It was on this fateful trip that David met the man who gave free candy to neighborhood kids. David Owen Brooks was born in Beaumont, Texas on the 12th of February in 1955. When David was only 6 years old, his parents, Mary and Alton, divorced. Following the divorce, David and his father moved to Houston while his mother remained in Beaumont. David and Dean formed a close bond, and some would say that Dean became a father figure to David.
In 1968, Corll Candy Company dissolved, and Mary moved to Colorado. Now that Dean was unemployed, he decided to become an electrician like his father. He gained employment with Houston Lighting and Power Company.
Soon after meeting Dean, David's historically good grades at Hamilton Junior High began to drop. They continued to drop until David dropped out of high school at only 15 years old. After dropping out of high school, David moved back to Beaumont to live with his mother. David frequently traveled to Houston to see his father and Dean. When he went to Houston, David often stayed at Dean's place. As the nights spent at Dean's became more frequent, Dean asked David to engage in oral sex with him for a payment of $5. At one point, in late 1970, David walked into Dean's apartment and saw Dean raping 2 boys who were strapped to a board. In order to keep David silent, Dean bought him a Corvette. When Dean realized that David wasn't going to run away from him after seeing the rapes, Dean told David that he would pay him $10 to bring other boys over. This proposition is how Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. came to know Dean Corll.
Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. was born in Houston, Texas on the 9th of May in 1956. His parents, Elmer Sr. and Mary, divorced when Elmer was 14 years old. Mary was awarded custody of Elmer and his 3 brothers. With the loss of Elmer Sr.'s income, Elmer Jr. felt like he needed to provide for the family. He dropped out of high school in the 9th grade and began working various jobs. In 1971, Elmer was approached by one of his old classmates, David Brooks. David had Elmer over to Dean's apartment, and while at the apartment, Dean told Elmer about an easy money-making opportunity. Dean told Elmer that he was involved in a Dallas organization that purchased and sold boys. Dean told Elmer that if he brought any boys to him, he would make good money. Elmer did not immediately take Dean up on the offer. It would take a year for Elmer to be desperate enough for money to bring a boy to Dean.
The exact number of victims raped, tortured, and murdered by Dean, David, and Elmer is unknown. Police were able to connect the serial killers to 29 victims, but police fear there may be more. Almost all of the 29 victims were either abducted or lured to Dean's residence to indulge in alcohol and drugs. Once at his residence, Dean would play a game with the boys that involved handcuffs. Dean would bet the boys that if they put his handcuffs on, they couldn't get them off without a key. If Dean didn't play the handcuff game, then the boys were drugged until they passed out, then handcuffed. When the boys were subdued, Dean stripped and handcuffed the boys to his torture board. The torture board was an 8 by 2.5 foot piece of plywood with holes cut out for wrist and ankle handcuffs. There was also plastic under the board to protect the floor from bodily fluids.
Once the boys were secured to the torture board, Dean would torture, rape, and sodomize them for hours and sometimes even days. When Dean was finished with a victim, he would kill them via strangulation or a .22 caliber pistol. If Dean strangled the boy, he would often leave the cord around the body's neck. After killing a boy, Dean would sprinkle lime on the body, then wrap the nude body in a plastic sheet and place it inside of a wooden body box. The body would then be transported in the wooden box and buried in a shallow grave in a predetermined location. Victims were only buried in 4 locations. The serial killers buried 17 victims inside the 12 by 30 foot stall number 11 at Southwest Boat Storage. They buried 4 bodies at Lake Sam Rayburn, 7 bodies in High Island, a community near Galveston, Texas, and 1 body at Jefferson County Beach. In order to keep suspicions low, Dean took many precautions. He bought handcuffs at different pawn shops, and he moved quite frequently.
The first known victim was 18-year-old Jeffrey Allen Conan. Jeffrey was born on the 20th of November in 1951 in Houston, Texas, to parents Harry and Sarah. He was a great student, graduating second in his class in high school. After high school, Jeffrey attended the University of Texas in Austin. On the 25th of September in 1970, Jeffrey hitchhiked from Austin to Houston. After arriving in Houston, Jeffrey ran into Dean. The exact details of his death are unknown, but Jeffrey's body was found in High Island on the 10th of August in 1973. His cause of death was strangulation.
The next victims were 14-year-old Danny Michael Yates and 14-year-old James Eugene Glass. Danny was born on the 9th of November in 1956 in Harris, Texas, to parents Glenn and Bobby. He had 2 siblings, Cindy and Brad. James was born in Harris, Texas, on the 28th of January in 1956 to parents Willie and Ima. He had an older brother, Willie Jr., and a younger sister, Pamela. On the 15th of December in 1970, Danny and James were attending a religious rally. Somehow the boys were lured away from the rally by David Brooks. As with many of the victims, the exact details of their death are unknown. Both boys were strangled and buried in the boat storage shed. Their bodies were located on the 8th of August in 1973.
The next set of victims were 15-year-old and 13-year-old brothers. Donald Wayne Waldrop was born in Georgia on the 15th of August in 1955 to parents Everett and Mary. Donald's younger brother, Jerry Lynn, was born on the 15th of September in 1957, also in Georgia. It was the 30th of January, 1971, when 15-year-old Donald and 13-year-old Jerry were abducted by Dean and David on their way to a local bowling alley. The brothers were taken back to Dean's residence. After Dean tortured the boys, David watched while Dean strangled each boy to death. The brothers were then buried in the same grave in the boat storage shed. When the brothers didn't arrive home that evening, their father Everett went to the police. As with many of the other victims, the police said that the boys were just runaways. The police did not conduct a search for the boys. Everett stayed in touch with the police for months, but after the police did nothing to find the boys, he moved back to Georgia because he was so upset. The boys were found on the 9th of August in 1973. And I just want to take a moment here and say that almost every parent of the boys that were abducted went to the police and said, "My child is missing. We need to do a search. This is not normal behavior." And almost every single time, the police were like, "Sorry, they're runaways. Nothing we can do." Like, they never conducted searches, no matter how old the boys were. They just said they were runaways, and they didn't, do anything. The parents were alone.
Yeah, there seemed to be this weird obsession back then that anybody, not obsession, but just this mindset that any kid who disappeared was a runaway, and that was that.
No, my child is 13 years old, and they said they were going to get a haircut. Now they're not coming back. Something happened. That's not normal. And a lot of the times these boys didn't take anything with them. Like, the parents would go look in their bedroom and their wallet would be there and all of their clothes. It wasn't like they packed up and left. They literally vanished.
Yeah, no, that makes no sense to just write that off as a runaway to me. I mean, why not look into it?
Yeah, I'm so glad the times have changed.
A friend of David Brooks, Randall Lee Harvey, was the next victim. Randall was born in 1959, and he was preceded in his death by his parents. On the 9th of March, 1971, Randall was riding his bike home from work when he crossed paths with David. David invited Randall back to Dean's apartment. It is unknown what happened next, but at some point, Randall was shot in the eye and strangled. He was later buried in the boat storage shed. Randall's body was not identified until 2008.
It was the 29th of May in 1971 when friends 13-year-old David William Hillegeist and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle went missing. David was born on the 30th of July in 1957 in Texas to parents Fred and Dorothy. David grew up in a Catholic household and had 5 siblings. Gregory was born on the 24th of January in 1955 in Alameda, California. His father, Harold, was in the Navy and died at a young age from Huntington's disease. Gregory's mother, Selma, had custody of Gregory and his younger brother. Selma was studying to be a nurse and was often not home in the evenings. Gregory used to work at Corll Candy Company sweeping floors. On the 29th of May, 1971, David told his mother he was going swimming with his 2 younger brothers. As David headed to the pool, he stopped at Gregory's house to see if he wanted to tag along. An hour later, David's mother got a call from one of David's younger brothers saying that they needed a ride home from the pool because David didn't go with them. David's mother, Dorothy, thought it was weird that her son didn't go to the pool, but she figured he was with some friends and he would be home soon. When night came and David still wasn't home, David's parents went searching for him. They searched the neighborhood, friends' houses, and hospitals, anywhere they thought David might be, but he was nowhere to be found. In the late evening of the 29th, Gregory's mother got home from work. She received a phone call from Gregory at around 11:30 p.m. Gregory told his mother that he was around 60 miles away in Freeport, swimming with some friends. Gregory told his mother that someone would be taking them home soon, so she went to bed. Selma awoke at 4:30 in the morning, realizing that Gregory still wasn't home, and she knew something was wrong. On the 30th, David's parents started searching again. At around 2 p.m., they learned that David was last seen with Gregory. David's parents then talked to Selma, and Selma shared what she knew. Although the boys' parents went to the police said that the boys were runaways and there was nothing they could do. David and Gregory were last seen getting into a white van. We know for sure that it was David Brooks who helped lure the boys to Dean. It is possible that the 2 boys went swimming with David Brooks, a familiar face from the candy store, and were then taken back to Dean's residence instead of their own. Both boys were strangled and buried in the boat storage shed. Their bodies were not discovered until the 9th of August in 1973.
The next victim was 17-year-old Reuben Wilford Watson Haney. Reuben was born in Houston, Texas on the 19th of April in 1954 to parents Tommy and Dorothy. On the 17th of August in 1971, Reuben received money from his grandmother to see a movie. He told his mother he would be home when she got off work at 7:30 p.m., but Reuben never made it home. At some point, Reuben ran into David Brooks. Reuben knew David and had no reason to suspect that what would happen next would lead to his demise. Reuben was strangled as David watched and then buried in the boat storage shed. His body was discovered on the 9th of August in 1973.
Although the exact date of his murder is unknown, it is known for sure that 17 or 18-year-old Roy Eugene Bunton was a victim of Dean Corll. Roy was born on the 31st of December in 1952 in Harris, Texas. His parents, Gilbert and Margaret, also had a daughter. At some point in 1971, Roy was last seen leaving the shoe store he worked at. It is believed that he then went hitchhiking. Roy was murdered and buried in the storage shed. Originally, his body was identified as Michael Belsch, and Roy's remains were not correctly identified until 2011.
At some point in 1971 or 1972, Dean murdered a boy whose age ranged from 15 to 17. The boy, known as Swimsuit Boy, was anywhere from 5'2" to 5'7". He was white or Hispanic with dark brown hair. The boy was found buried in the boat storage shed. He was wearing red, white, and blue striped swim trunks, a long-sleeved t-shirt with a peace symbol, and an ankle bracelet. The Swimsuit Boy was also found with blue corduroy pants and brown cowboy boots. As of today, Swimsuit Boy remains the only unidentified victim of Dean Corll.
It was February of 1972 when Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. took Dean up on his offer to bring him a boy in exchange for money. Willard Carmen Rusty Branch Jr. was only 17 when he was killed by Dean. Rusty was born on the 2nd of July in 1954 in Harris, Texas, to parents Willard Sr. and Bonnie. He also had a sister named Susan. On the 9th of February, Elmer brought Rusty to Dean's house. Rusty was no stranger at Dean's residence. He had been there before to partake in drugs. But this time was different. He wouldn't be leaving alive. Dean followed his normal routine with Rusty, but before he buried him, he cut off Rusty's genitals and placed them in a plastic bag. Dean then buried Rusty in the boat storage shed with his genitals buried next to him, and he was not identified until 1985. Elmer was later paid $200 for bringing Rusty to Dean.
The second known victim of 1972 was one of Elmer's friends, 18-year-old Frank Anthony Aguirre. Frank was born on the 22nd of August in 1953 in Houston, Texas. Frank's parents, Josephine and Frank, had two children after Frank, Ronnie and Deborah. On the 24th of March, Frank headed home after finishing his shift at Long John Silver's. He was supposed to meet up with his girlfriend, Rhonda Williams, but instead he went to Dean's place to smoke pot with Elmer. Frank's body was found in High Island on the 13th of August in 1973. He had been strangled.
The next victim was 17-year-old Mark Stephen Scott. Mark was born on the 16th of July in 1954 in Texas to parents Mary and Walter. He also had a younger brother named Jeff. Mark was last seen alive on the 20th of April in 1972. A few days after his disappearance, Mark's parents received a postcard in the mail saying that Mark had received a job working in Austin. In reality, Mark went over to Dean's to hang out with his friends David and Elmer. The exact date of Mark's murder is unknown, but it is known that when Dean tried to subdue Mark, Mark pulled out a knife and tried to stab Dean. Elmer left the room and searched for a gun as Dean grabbed Mark's knife-wielding arm. Elmer ended up not needing the gun because Dean strangled Mark to death. He was later buried at High Island, and his remains have never been found. So I have two things to say here. One, this is the start of Dean Corll having his victims fill out envelopes or postcards with his parents' addresses on them so that he can later forge letters or postcards to the parents saying, "Oh, I'm out finding a job. That's why, I'm gone. Don't worry about my disappearance." So that's totally an H.H. Holmes move. And the second thing is that police believe his remains have never been found because of Hurricane Ike and how he was born, near Galveston, which is literally it's an island in the Gulf of Mexico and how this area where Dean buried people has been washed away.
Next, Dean murdered two friends, 16-year-old Johnny Ray DeLome and 17-year-old Billie Jean Belch Jr. Johnny was born in Crowley, Louisiana on the 9th of August in 1955. His parents, Gerland and Eunice, had a second son whom they named Edward. Billy was born on the 21st of April in 1955 in Houston, Texas. His parents, Billy and Maggie, had two other sons, Michael and Marvin. And at one time, Billy was a door-to-door salesman for the Corll Candy Company. On the 21st of May, Johnny and Billy went out to get a few drinks at the store. At some point, their paths crossed with the serial killers. A few days after their disappearances, both sets of parents received letters from Madisonville, Texas, approximately 70 miles away, saying that Johnny and Billy had gotten jobs and would be home in about a month. Both sets of parents believed the envelopes were addressed by the boys, but the actual letters were forged. While at Dean's residence, Elmer shot Johnny in the forehead, but Johnny didn't die. Elmer then strangled Johnny while Dean helped. Next, Billy was strangled, and both bodies were buried in High Island. Their bodies were not found until the 13th of August in 1973. Michael's body was originally incorrectly identified as another victim, and this error was corrected in September of 2010.
The next victim was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman. Stephen was born on the 2nd of August in 1954. His parents, Eugene and Irma, went on to have a second child whom they named Sandy. On the evening of the 19th of July in 1972, Stephen left a party in the Heights. At some point, Stephen was brought back to Dean's house, although it is unknown if it was forced or if he did so on his own accord. Stephen was subsequently bludgeoned in the chest, leading to 3 fractured ribs, and strangled. His body was buried in the boat storage shed and wasn't identified until April of 2011. Stephen's remains were originally identified as Mark Scott's.
The next set of victims was 14-year-old Wally J. Semino and 13-year-old Richard Edward Hembry. Wally was born on the 30th of January in 1958 in Houston, Texas, to parents Wallace and Mildred, and Richard was born on the 12th of March in 1959 in South Carolina to parents Ralph and Ruby. On the 3rd of October in 1972, Wally and Richard were last seen getting into a white van parked outside of a grocery store. It is believed that the two boys were abducted and brought back to Dean's residence. Wally was able to call his mother from Dean's phone, but the call was disconnected before Wally could tell his mother what was happening. Before the two boys were strangled, Elmer accidentally shot Richard in the jaw. Wally and Richard were buried in the boat storage shed, and their bodies were found on the 8th of August in 1973.
I hope this comment doesn't come off as offensive, but I really am wondering if the stereotype of the white van with the words free candy on the side somehow came from Dean Corll, because he was abducting these boys in these white vans and he was giving free candy away.
Oh, no, absolutely. Like, I'm not at all making fun or joking. It's not a joke. It's just, I've honestly always, after I found out about this case, I always assumed, like, oh, that's where that stereotype came from. Like, I've just always kind of written that off as fact in my head, and it may have existed before that, but I mean, this was going on, 50 years ago, and in my head, it's just like, oh, yeah, well, that is probably where that stereotype comes from, of a white van, free candy, the candy man, like all that sort of like stranger danger stuff that you're taught as a kid. It would make sense to me that it would come from here.
Definitely. The last known murder to occur in 1972 was that of 19-year-old Richard Allen Kepner. Richard was a carpenter's assistant who was born on the 17th of September in 1953. His mother, Joanne, had 4 other children. On the 12th of November, 1972, Richard was abducted while he made his way to a payphone to call his fiancée. He was later strangled and buried in High Island. Richard's remains were identified in 1983 via dental records.
The first known murder of 1973 was of 17-year-old Joseph Allen Lyles. Joseph, an artist who loved to roller skate, was born in 1955. He and his sister Barbara lived down the street from David Brooks. On the 1st of February, Joseph was abducted and taken to Dean's house. His cause of death is unknown, but Joseph's remains were located on accident on Jefferson County Beach in 1983. They weren't ID'd until November 2009.
So Joseph Lyles has been linked to Dean Corll as one of his victims, but this is the only body that was buried in Jefferson County Beach. That's why his remains were found on accident, because they didn't know to look there. But after they found his body, they realized that it was buried in the same exact way as all of Dean Corll's other victims, so wrapped in plastic and covered in lime. And he was, of the age that Dean Corll was attacking, and so police, determined that Dean Corll was the murderer. After the murder of Joseph Lyles, Elmer tried his best to enlist in the military, but due to his lack of education, his enlistment was denied. Some might say that Dean Corll felt that Elmer was starting to drift away, and that's why the next few months were filled with more bloodshed than usual.
The next victim was a friend of Elmer's, 15-year-old William Ray Billy Lawrence. Billy was born on the 11th of March in 1958 in Houston, Texas. At the time of Billy's birth, his parents, Horace and Mary, already had a son named James. On the 4th of June, 1973, Billy called his dad to say he was going fishing with some friends. He didn't tell his father the name of his friends, and he said he would return later that week. On the 11th of June, Billy's parents received a letter that was postmarked the 8th. The letter said Billy was looking for a job in Austin and would return later in the summer. It's believed that Billy was still alive on the 10th. He was later strangled and buried near Lake Sam Rayburn, and Billy's remains were not found until the 9th of August, 1973.
The third victim of 1973, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Ray Blackburn, was murdered only 11 days later. Ray was born to Reverend and Mrs. Robert Reed Blackburn on the 19th of April, 1953, in Mississippi. At the time of his disappearance, Ray was married to a woman named Myrtle. Ray, Myrtle, and their child lived in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. On the 15th of June, 1973, Ray was hitchhiking back to Louisiana when he was abducted by Dean. He was later strangled and buried near Lake Sam Rayburn.
The next victim was 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia. Homer was born on the 10th of February, 1958, in Houston, Texas, to parents Luis and Doris. Homer knew Elmer through a driver's education course they were taking together, and on the 7th of July, 1973, 3 weeks after killing Ray Blackburn, Homer was invited to Dean's house for a party. Homer was later shot in the head and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn.
John Manning, Johnny Sellers, was the next murder victim. The 17-year-old United States Marine was born on the 14th of July, 1954, in Orange County, Texas. His parents, Manning and Gloria, later had a son whom they named Timothy. Johnny went missing on the 12th of July, 1973, just 5 days after Homer Garcia was murdered. His car was found burned to a crisp on the 19th. Johnny was shot 4 times in the chest with a rifle. His body was found on High Island when Elmer and David led police to his gravesite. There was no plastic covering Johnny's fully clothed body. Johnny was identified through dental records. At first, police did not believe that Johnny was one of Dean Corll's victims. Johnny was not buried like the other victims, nude, covered in plastic and lime. He was also shot with a rifle instead of a pistol. But because Elmer and David led police to his gravesite, Johnny was determined to be a victim of the Houston mass murders.
At around this time, David Brooks learned that his girlfriend Bridget was expecting their first child. So the couple married, and David moved out of Dean's and into an apartment with Bridget. The marriage and the move could explain why David wasn't involved in the next 3 murders.
The next victim was previous victim Billy Belsh's brother, 15-year-old Michael Anthony Belsh. Michael was born on the 8th of August, 1957, in Houston, Texas. On the 19th of July, 1973, a year after his brother was murdered, and only a week after Johnny Sellers went missing, Michael left the house to get a haircut. He was abducted by Elmer and Dean, and later strangled and shot 2 times in the head. Michael's body was buried in the boat storage shed and was not discovered until the 8th of August, 1973.
Less than a week after the murder of Anthony, Dean murdered 2 of Elmer's friends, 18-year-old Marty Ray Jones and 17-year-old Charles Carey Cobble. Marty was born in Harris, Texas to parents Kenneth and Betty Joe on the 3rd of June, 1955, and Charles was born on the 10th of March, 1956 in Harris, Texas to parents Vern and Betty. At 14 years old, Charles married another 14-year-old named Deborah. Charles later dropped out of high school and became roommates with the other high school dropout, Marty. On the 25th of July, 1973, 6 days after murdering Michael Belsch, Marty and Charles walked into Dean's apartment. While there, Elmer choked Marty to death and shot Charles twice in the head. The bodies were buried in the boat's storage shed and were found on the 8th of August, 1973. Both Marty and Charles' remains were identified through dental records.
The last known murder Dean Corll committed was that of 13-year-old James Stanton Dramella. James was born in Houston, Texas on the 14th of September, 1959, to parents Barbara Elaine and James. He also had a younger sister. James was a busy teenager. He mowed lawns, played cornet, rode a unicycle, and was part of the track team. On the 3rd of August, 1973, 9 days after the murders of Marty and Charles, James left his house to go on a bike ride. He was abducted at a gas station and taken back to Dean's residence. James was later strangled and buried in the boat storage shed. Although James was the last to disappear, he was the first to be discovered. He was the first to be discovered when his remains were discovered on the 8th of August, 1973. His bike was also found in the boat storage shed and was later used to help identify him as a victim.
On the evening of the 7th of August, 1973, 15-year-old Rhonda Williams' drunk father was yelling at her in their house. If you'll recall, Rhonda Williams was Frank Aguirre's girlfriend before he became a murder victim in 1972. Elmer overheard the yelling and came to his friend's rescue. The two left her house and headed to Dean's Pasadena residence along with 19-year-old Tim Curley. When the three arrived at Dean's house, they proceeded to huff paint, drink, and smoke marijuana. It wasn't long before Dean said he was going to bed. He had to get up early in the morning for work. Elmer, Rhonda, and Tim continued to party until they passed out.
Early the next morning, Rhonda woke up as Dean was kicking her. She looked around and noticed that she, Elmer, and Tim were hog-tied with duct tape over their mouths. Dean untied Elmer, and the two headed to a different room. When they came back, Dean told Elmer to take care of Rhonda. Dean then took Tim into his bedroom and stripped him naked, then handcuffed him to the torture board. Dean then told Elmer to bring Rhonda to the bedroom. Elmer carried Rhonda into the bedroom, where a naked Dean told Elmer to take off Rhonda's clothes. Dean then told Tim to have sex with Rhonda, but he said he couldn't. He was attached to the board. Dean then told Tim he had a few minutes to make it happen, and he and Elmer left the room. Dean and Elmer kept entering and leaving the room as time dragged on. At one point, Dean was focused on torturing Tim when Elmer noticed that the .22 caliber was laying unguarded on the dresser. Elmer grabbed the pistol and pointed it at Dean. He said he couldn't keep killing his friends. Dean stood up and came toward Elmer while telling Elmer that he wouldn't do anything. Elmer started shooting Dean until he fell dead on the floor. Elmer then called the police. It was approximately 8:15 a.m., then untied Rhonda and Tim.
When the police arrived at Dean's Pasadena residence, they saw two men and a woman sitting on the sidewalk near a pistol. Elmer told the police that he had killed a man inside. Police put each one of the people into a patrol car and then put the pistol inside of a separate patrol truck. The officers then entered the house and found Dean's body. They went back outside and read 17-year-old Elmer his Miranda rights. After they finished, Elmer said that he had to get something off his chest. There were more bodies. Elmer was then taken to the police station where he told a homicide detective that he knew of more dead bodies. He told police two names, Corll and Jones. The Pasadena police then called the Houston Police Department and asked if they had any missing persons reports for a Corll and or Jones. The Houston Police Department confirmed that Corll and Jones were both missing persons. Pasadena police then took Elmer to the Houston Police Department so that he could identify pictures of both boys. After identifying Corll and Jones as victims, the police let Elmer lead them to the burial location. Police searched Southwest Boat Storage Stall number 11 from 6:30 p.m. to 11:30 p.m. that evening, where they were able to exhume 8 bodies. The next morning at around 10 a.m., Elmer met with a homicide detective. He confessed to how he met Dean, how the killings began, where they buried the bodies, etc. When Elmer finished confessing, he and the police headed to the next burial location, Lake Sam Rayburn. They stayed out exhuming bodies until around 10:30 that evening.
Also on the 9th of August, 18-year-old David Brooks went to the police station with his father and uncle. He told police he had information about Elmer Henley Jr. While at the police station, David confessed to knowing Dean, but denied having anything to do with the murders. But the next day, he ended up giving a full confession where he stated that he helped aid Dean and Elmer abduct, torture, and murder young boys. After confessing, David went to Lake Sam Rayburn with police and helped identify burial sites. For the next few days, Elmer and David continued to help police find bodies at the storage shed, Lake Sam Rayburn, and High Island.
Elmer Wayne Henley Jr. was charged for the murders of Frank Aguirre, Homer Garcia, Charles Cobble, Marty Jones, William Lawrence, and Johnny DeLome. He was not charged for the murder of Dean Corll because the death was ruled as self-defense. Elmer pled not guilty to all counts brought against him. Elmer's week-long trial began in July of 1974. On the 16th of July, the jury found Elmer guilty on all counts after deliberating for just an hour. He was later sentenced to 6 99-year sentences to be served consecutively. At the time the crimes were committed, there was no death penalty for mass murder. At this time, the word serial killer had not been created yet. In December of 1978, Elmer's conviction was overturned on appeal. In the original trial, Elmer was denied an evidentiary hearing, the jury was not sequestered, and the trial did not have a change of venue. By June of 1979, he was retried and once again found guilty on all murders. Elmer was resentenced to 6 life sentences on the 11th of July, 1979.
David Owen Brooks's trial began in February of 1975, where he was charged with only the murder of William Lawrence. Because he admitted to being present during the murder, David pled not guilty. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes before they found David to be guilty on the 4th of March. He was sentenced to life in prison on the 4th of April, 1975. I thought it was really interesting that the jury in David's trial took 90 minutes to deliberate one murder, and the jury for Elmer's trial took 60 minutes to deliberate 6 murders.
I feel like when there's more murders stacked against somebody, they're probably a little more likely to be like, yeah, well, he did this, guilty. Like, you know, if it's one murder, I'm wondering if they were just more deliberating whether or not he was guilty. I don't know. But he pled not guilty. I don't know.
No, I think that's a really valid point. Like, one murder would be so much harder to find someone guilty for than 6. Like, it's so much easier. Because once you get past finding them guilty for one murder, it'd be like, yeah, he's guilty for the rest.
Right, exactly. Elmer Henley Jr. was first eligible for parole on the 29th of April, 1980. As of 2015, Elmer's been denied parole 20 times. His most recent parole hearing was in October of 2015. On the 1st of September 2015, a new law was passed that allows parole boards to extend parole eligibility terms to 10 years instead of 3. Because Elmer was denied parole in October of 2015, the board will be able to extend his next hearing until October of 2025.
That's really great for the families. They don't have to go every 3 years now. David Brooks was first eligible for parole on the 20th of November, 1979. As of 2015, David had been denied parole 21 times. His most recent parole hearing was in January of 2015, and his next parole hearing is in early 2018. If he is denied parole, his next hearing won't be for 10 years.
Elmer Henley Jr. is currently imprisoned at the Mark W. Michael Unit in Texas. He's become quite the painter, and Elmer's work has been shown in many exhibitions and is also for sale.
David Brooks is currently imprisoned at the C.T. Terrell Unit in Texas. He is the father of a daughter.
Rhonda Williams' father did not want custody of his daughter after the incident at Dean Corll's Pasadena residence. A judge ordered Rhonda to change her last name to Griffin and go to the residential program Hope Center for Youth. After 40 years of silence, Rhonda was able to talk about what happened to her on the 8th of August, 1973.
Tim Curley went on to become a wealthy salesman and the dad of a son, Tim Jr. But the events on the 8th of August, 1973, left him in a pit of alcoholism and depression. Tim died of a heart attack at the young age of 55. Oh my.
Yeah, it's heavy. So, Dean Corll, woo.
I think we've covered a lot of stuff and we talked along the way. So my only question to you is that a lot of people feel sorry for David Brooks and Elmer Henley Jr. Do you think that they should have been found less culpable for their actions because they were young and possibly under Dean's brainwashing?
That's hard. no matter what answer I give, I'm probably damned if I do and damned if I don't. I can understand that viewpoint of them being young and having maybe been kind of under the spell of this manipulative character, because that's certainly something that happens. But at the same time, it's hard for me to justify, especially, Elmer being involved in, let's be honest, more than 6 of the murders. And David was involved in far more than the one. And so these guys, yeah, they were young, but at the same time, I mean, they were literally abducting and helping torture and murder a bunch of innocent people. So at the same time, I can't. I have a hard time feeling bad for them. I've never been brainwashed, so I probably can't really speak to something like that and what that would be like. But I can't imagine, abducting and murdering your own friends and giving them over to this monster of a man. I just don't understand that.
So one thing that comes up in the argument, because I also feel the same as you, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And there's definitely a way to see both sides to the arguments. One thing that comes up a lot is that David and Elmer were afraid to not help Dean because of this Dallas organization. They were afraid that the people from this organization that supposedly Dean was abducting boys for was going to come get them. But to me, that's not a great argument because they thought they were just helping Dean buy and sell these boys. Obviously, they were murdering the boys. So the boys weren't going anywhere. So, I mean, that could be a valid argument for the beginning. But after they knew they were being murdered, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's hard. I'd love to say that I feel bad for them, but I don't that much. I can understand both sides of it though. Like I get it. It's a tough situation to kind of know what someone was thinking or how they felt as far as pressure or whatever in the moment, but killing's killing.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for coming along for the ride, Stephen. I love when you come on to talk about the heavy hitters.
Absolutely. I enjoy doing it, as dark and depressing as it can be. It's always fun to come on and try out, a different type of podcasting than I usually do.
Until next time, please remember to check your back seats, and I'll see you at the next rest stop. If you didn't know already, you can also listen to me on the We're All Just Pretending podcast, where I give bad advice on purpose. You can also find Jess and me on the Playlist podcast. Playlist is a podcast where Josh Hallmark of Our Americana and the Karen and Ellen Letters has different podcasters on to talk about their favorite songs. Every episode has a different theme and a new panel of podcasters. You can find Murder Road Trip at murderroadtrip.com, on Instagram and Twitter at Murder Trip, and on Facebook at Murder Road Trip Podcast. If you're interested in continuing the discussion, you can join the Murder Road Trip Podcast group on Facebook. Make sure to check out the Murder Road Trip playlist on Spotify. You can even add songs to the playlist. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast app of choice. Please stay tuned after the music to hear from some other great podcasts.
Hey everybody, this is your best friend Steven.
And this is your best friend Chris.
And we're the hosts of the podcast, Is This Adulting?
Every week, we sit down to talk about life, debate pointless topics, and most importantly, break the stigma on mental illness through opening up about our own struggles and how it affects us every day. Oh, and do you like games? We got those too.
What about guests from all your favorite podcasts?
Ooh, like Justin from Generation Y, or Nina from Already Gone, or Hal Lublin from Everything. And of course, you can't forget our special guest, Tom Bodette from those Motel 6 commercials. Okay, that last one might have been a stretch.
Yeah, just like them. So, join us each Thursday as we attempt to navigate adulthood as overgrown man-children. And remember, kids, be happy, stay healthy, and go hug someone.
Because you never know. They might just be the host of your new favorite podcast.